socialist outlook, because you start off with the fact that both reject the idea that production should be based on the goals of accumulation and profit. You can't have an ecological society if the decisions are always guided by the idea of producing more, selling more, mining more, drilling more, and so on. So that's sort of the starting point, in a way, for the book. And what I've tried to do, as I say at the beginning, it's been written over a long period of time in the form initially of separate articles, which attempted at each stage to deal with the whole range of issues as I saw them. And one issue sort of piled on top of the other, or whatever was left open, I then tried to deal with in the next issue, in the next article. So I want to just essentially give you an overview of what I talk about in the book, not take too much time with that, and really leave up to questions and comments other aspects, things that maybe in the book that I haven't mentioned in the summary, or just other concerns that you have, because obviously there are unanswered questions at the end in terms of how to build a movement, but that's what it comes up to. I mean, that's the task. We have this tremendously pressing situation, a situation of survival. I mean, all the arguments for socialism are arguments that have been around for a long time and that you're all familiar with. What's new in the last generation or two is that the demand for socialism is really a condition for survival of the species. It's become that, and is increasingly clear that this is the case. And it's precisely in response to that situation, I think, that the capitalist response has become increasingly unhinged. And this is something that was well pointed out in Naomi Klein's book 4 years ago, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. She points out, based on interviews with capitalists, that they understand that this struggle for an ecological society is directed against them, and that's why they're so opposed to it. So it's just some of the people sort of in the middle who have the hope or the expectation that you can bring about the necessary changes without transforming the society. So I give a fair amount of attention to that whole argument, the argument about the possibilities of green capitalism, and I argue that it's not enough just to change the form of energy that's used, but you have to reduce the total ecological footprint, and that even if you had all the private cars run with solar cells, you'd still have this enormous utilization of space, pavement, and materials steadily increasing, so that the world would still become a dangerous place in terms of the survivals, not only of our species, but of many others as well. So in terms of the sequence of the exposition, I begin with a critique of waste, and I try to make the point that we shouldn't assume that all of the consumption or of the energy production that needs to cut back, it wouldn't be all taken away from what we need in order to live or in order to have decent lives. That so much of the energy that's used, so much of the materials that are used serve purposes which are not at all conducive to human well-being, the most obvious being the military, but also all the other wasteful aspects of capitalist society, which all in turn have themselves been criticized for a long time. I mean, notably in recent years, within the last 50 years, by Brown and Sweezy in their classic book, Monopoly Capital, where they talk about the irrational society. And I think it was reading that may have helped me sort of coalesce my views about all the sectors that could be eliminated or drastically reduced in this society. I sort of build upon that in the first chapter to go into that whole issue. Another basic theme is the idea, which I introduced there, and it comes back later also, that because of the gravity of the crisis as it now exists, the people who claim that that by being moderate and by just advocating some minor changes, they're being more realistic, this is an unreal kind of position now. It's a position that may have had some validity in a period of relative stability, where a little bit of change in the point of view of one small sector of the U.S. population could make a difference. But once you have this extreme danger that we have now, and the timeline is very short, as pointed out in the recent UN Commission report, once you have that, the moderate position is the unrealistic one. It's unrealistic to think that the environment can be saved without drastic changes. So the drastic changes, however difficult it might seem to bring them about and to get the vast popular movement that would be necessary to do that, however far, however remote a vision that might be, it's nonetheless the only realistic possibility. And that's the nature of the crisis now, that we have to have a radical change, and the radical change by its very nature, in order to come about, has to be one in which the overwhelming majority of the people participate actively. And this is not just because we like everyone to participate and like to have democratic things, but it's because it's the only way it's possible. Because we're talking about changes in people's lives, and in order to go through the changes, to accept the changes, to promote them and to encourage others, people have to be mobilized. So it's all these things go together. I mean, that's the bringing together of all the different aspects of the movement in that sense. So another big dimension, implicit already in the title, is the technological aspect. Partly starting off from the fact that technology is at the center of the study of capitalism anyway. I mean, certainly you can appreciate that from the writings of Marx himself, but also, and more specifically, the capitalist assumption that for every severe problem of like the environment, there's a technological solution, there's a technological fix of some kind. This has to be demolished or deconstructed or whatever you want to say. That we have to develop the idea that not all technologies are positive, not all innovations are good. I mean, there's this great cult of innovation around capitalism. I'll just read one brief passage that sums up my point on that, because this is one of the things I often run up against. The almost cult-like reverence for innovation that permeates U.S. American culture is a clear expression of capitalist interests in their constant search for newly marketable commodities. But this is not the only possible goal for innovative thinking. An eco-socialist premise would stimulate innovation in quite different directions, notably toward a rethinking of assumptions about basic human needs and how they can be met. So obviously there's a task of separating the production that serves human needs from the production that exists and is carried on only for the sake of preserving the particular social order and defending the privileges of those who hold them. And so that's a big emphasis. And then the critique of technology goes into, there's a chapter called Socialism and Technology, a Sectoral Overview, where I look at each of the principal sectors of the economy and talk about the way in which it's evolved under capitalism and what hints there are of how it would be under socialism. And this is something that it would take too long to go into every single aspect of that. But the general point is, also the underlying assumption is that a technology has to be understood not just in terms of particular devices, but in terms of the whole arrangement within which these devices are used and what determines how many of them there are and that type of thing. So again, obviously the transportation sector is an easy one to point out as an example of this, because the device of the internal combustion engine, or the device, even if you have a differently run motor, how widely should that be distributed? How many of them should there be? How many of them do we need? Why can't you have a collective, much more reliance on collective transport than individual? What has been the whole dynamic that's made it seem that the only way to organize it is on the basis of having individual ownership of particular vehicles? And so all the technology also comes into play when you talk about things like healthcare, and you can recognize the validity or the usefulness of many of the sometimes extraordinary techniques that have evolved for treating certain disorder or ailments. But then there's the question of, well, why is so much of this needed? I mean, and isn't much of the necessity for these very sophisticated treatments a result of the fact that the basic conditions of human health have been undermined, and you need to have less of a dependence on all those exquisite forms of surgery and that have been developed. They can't possibly be made available to everyone, especially as the public health in a basic way declines further and further. So it's a question of reordering priorities and the technological issue in all these sectors. I also devote quite a bit of attention to agriculture, capitalist agriculture, how it's evolved, how it's encouraged the development of various toxins and poisons and genetic modification, and what that signifies, and how any attempt to restore the basic underpinning of agriculture, which is the healthy soil, that's being lost. And so how do you regain that? It's a whole different approach to technology. So it's not that whether you're for or against technology, it's a question of what kind of technology and on what social basis is it possible to introduce or reintroduce a technology that's healthy. And there is a theme that comes back from time to time to the effect that certain ways of doing things that may have been practiced among humans prior to the advent of capitalism may have to be recovered. That capitalism has to be seen as an aberration, not as the natural state of humanity. And that may seem obvious to all of us, but I think to many people, the idea of competing and aggressiveness and all, are seen as being part of human nature. We have to remind ourselves that this does represent a particular phase of human history. It's bringing on the catastrophe, and in order to find sort of the wealth of possible alternatives, we need to also go back into human experience and learn what we can from earlier periods. So there's a section also, for example, where I talk about the importance of indigenous cultures around the world and of their relationship to the natural world, to Mother Earth, as it's often called, and to the fact that indeed they're being recognized a bit more on the international scene, but it needs to go much further. So what that suggests is the theme of cultural transformation. It gets back into the underlying questions about human nature and what is a good life, because all this has to be called into question. And that's what is really involved when you talk about everyone being involved in the process of bringing about a transformation. It's precisely because the changes that need to take place in how we live are quite considerable, especially in the countries where we're used to high levels of certain types of consumption and luxury and so on. And this is, of course, also a profoundly democratic approach. And in terms of the whole issue of how the economy is organized, I emphasize, and this is where the theme of the Soviet experience becomes important, that biodiversity often involves an emphasis on the local economies, on on local self-sufficiency, which is very important in a certain sphere, but it doesn't encompass all the issues that have to be taken care of, because the natural environment recognizes no borders, and for certain types of activity like transportation networks, they have to be planned on a larger scale. So we have to accept the idea of planning, recognizing that planning takes place anyway. It's just a question of who does it, and that's the real issue. And I do have a sort of appreciative yet critical discussion of earlier experiences with planning, recognizing some of their achievements, but at the same time pointing out that where they ran into problems, obstacles, and failures was precisely because of the failure of communication between the different sectors that were involved, which could have been addressed had the whole structure been more democratic. And I think there's a fair amount of consensus about this. And in terms of people's ability to think and practice and act in those ways, I also refer to experiences of workers' self-management, which is something that's taken place sort of in certain isolated instances, but I've found, especially in my research, at times of revolutionary upheaval, when the whole set of assumptions under which people have lived are drawn into question, and in which everything is in motion, that there is a ready impulse, a ready capacity for people to take control of their own immediate surroundings and think in new ways about how to undertake processes that they've been carrying on for a long time. And we've seen this during various revolutions. I sort of witnessed it in part, or read about it a good deal, but knew some of the people involved in Chile, because I did my research in Chile back in the 60s and early 70s. And of course, during that period when there was a left-wing government from 70 to 73, it provided a kind of cover for a lot of radical movements from below. And I think we've seen this again also in recent years in Venezuela. And one of the things that both those experiences suggest is that there's a kind of mutual dependence between what is done at the level of the national state and what is done at the level of the local neighborhood or enterprise, and that each depends on the other. And that's very much part of my general approach to things. But so where the initiative for the change will come from, we can't tell. We have to work at both levels, both at the level of challenging the political power at the center of the society, but also building up our own institutions at the base. And again, all this, as I say this, especially to an audience like this, I feel that I'm telling you things you already know, but it's not widely appreciated in the outside society. And so our task, if we're already activists, is to promote these kinds of discussions and this kind of developing awareness as much as we can everywhere, and sort of recognize that our efforts in this respect are pushed forward, I would say, not only by the objective urgency in terms of the deterioration of the environment, but also by the frenzied reaction of capital and the extreme forms in which its political practice is showing itself nowadays, which again is which everyone recognizes. And there has been a certain amount of increase in attention to what socialists have to say, however socialism may be understood by different sectors of the population. But we have a more favorable environment for spreading these ideas, and we have to take advantage of it as a matter of great urgency. The final dimension that I get into because of this is precisely this larger dimension of how we bring together all the different constituencies that will need to be involved if we're going to speak of a majority process, and one that can really take charge. And I can't claim to have final answers for any of this, but I've been impressed by the increasing awareness among people, even in this country, of the importance of all the different movements against oppression coming together on some basis. And so I've described, and this is one of the core arguments, even in defining eco-socialism, that the environmental issue is a class issue, in the sense that while everybody, without exception, has an interest in a sound environment, there's a definite class that stands in the way of taking the measures that are necessary. So this brings us back to the point Naomi Klein was making about how the capitalists understand that the environmental movement is, in its essence, a movement directed against everything that they represent, because it represents establishing a different basis for deciding how the economy should be organized and what priorities should be set, and the whole idea of even cutting back the production of certain things, which is absolutely anathema to the thinking of capital. So recognizing that the environment is a class issue, how do you constitute the class that will replace the capitalist class? And of course the conception, the understanding of what the working class is something that has been evolving historically as certain occupations have been dispersed around the globe. We no longer have so much of an industrial working class in the countries known as the global north. What does this mean for organizing? These are subjects of discussion, but I guess what I've tried to do, especially in this in the 8th chapter, which was originally written for a collection of articles in the journal New Political Science on the subject of intersectionality, is establish a kind of the basis for understanding how each of the various anti-oppression groups really, it's in their own interest as well in the interest of everyone else for them to recognize a link between their struggles and the class struggle. And this has been obstructed. You might say that there was a whole, if you study the history or you think about the history of the left, through which many of us have lived the last couple of generations, that the new left of the 1960s represented the flourishing of many separate movements that didn't come together in any organized way. There was a kind of awareness of commonality, and some might be inspired by others. Each group that raised its voice in protest was inspired by what other groups did, but they were not didn't act together as a unified, coherent political force, and that's what was missing. So part of the argument to undergird the development of such a political force, I said again, is recovering something that did exist earlier, but perhaps in not sufficiently well worked out form, which was an approach that recognized the centrality of class in political terms. And this whole approach, which was consciously advanced by socialists and communists in in the first half of the 20th century, was of course consciously repressed in the post-World War II period. And so when the left came back, there was a kind of fear of this kind of unity. Not only was there fear, but when any attempts to develop it met again with violent repression. I'm thinking especially of the extremely severe repression against the Black Panther Party, which was which had its roots in a popular movement, and although it represented a particular sector of the society, their analysis was one that recognized the structural aspects of what they had to overcome, and this approach of looking of orienting oneself towards each separate sector, whether it was racially defined or in terms of gender or sexual orientation or age or disability or even an issue focus like war or the environment, the separateness of these different struggles was reinforced, I argue in the book, by the postmodernist kind of attitude that was encouraged in institutions of higher education. So it's all kind of a matter of opinion. We can each have our political, our different sources of support and our different struggles, and well, they might all come together, but anything that attempted to bring them together was called a grand narrative. And grand narrative was something that you scorned. It was something you were suspicious of. So I think we have to overcome that resistance to what they call grand narratives, recognize that what they call grand narrative is what we would call theory, or an overarching theory. And not that any given overarching theory doesn't have to go through all kinds of development and argumentation. It's always evolving. The theory is always evolving. It's not a fixed, static kind of phenomenon, but it is something whose importance has to be recognized. And I think also that if you're talking about building a movement that can grow and not be subjected to or not become vulnerable to attacks, there has to be a kind of common understanding, as well as the common commitment. That's what gives it strength. It provides a backbone, continuity, the basis for developing a committed constituency. So that's really the direction in which the argument develops. Whether there's beyond that what to say. I guess the only other thing I mentioned initially is that a lot of people look at this vision in which everybody's participating, we're all transforming ourselves, everybody has to be heavily involved in order for it to come about at all, and say, well, who wants to do all that? I mean, who wants to be going to meetings all the time and having all these discussions? And why don't we leave it to someone else to take care of it? We'll elect the right persons, and they'll do the job for us. That doesn't work. I mean, that's an attitude that's encouraged by the U.S. System, the U.S. ideology, which is very much a spectator kind of system. You look at these and you have a horse race, and you go, I like this one better than that one. Well, I'll vote for them, and they'll do what we need. No, that's what we have to get. We have to recognize that democracy, in a true sense, is not confined to just choosing who's going to speak for us. It's acting on our own behalf. But in order to be able to do that, we have to also create the institutions in which that becomes a natural and even pleasurable aspect of our interaction with our fellow human beings, and it has to be facilitated in a practical sense. For example, the whole idea that part of one's work time is taken up with these discussions, so one is being paid while one's undertaking the discussion. One has to have the adequate education, hopefully in the society, but if not, then we have to create the education, do it ourselves, and obviously the information. Also, we have to have all the alternative media, and in the society we eventually create. I mean, there's no separation really between what we have to do in order to create the movement and the kinds of things we want to find in the society that's the product of these efforts. And there has to be also, if we're talking about getting everybody involved in the discussion, there have to be structures that facilitate, that make it easy, and that take into account the difficulties that people with who've grown up under certain conditions may have in participating in this. And so it's a delicate psychological thing at the same time that it's a matter of having the structures. So you not only need to require, say, any political representative to be to come to meetings and so on, but you have to also have the necessary additional steps we might associate with facilitation to draw everybody in, to make everybody feel comfortable in participating in these things, and to be able to learn from the ideas of people who might be otherwise reluctant to express themselves. So there's a whole lot of things that have to be rethought or built upon. And I mean, there are positive examples of most of this here and there in different places. And what we have to do is learn from these, remember these, build on them, and develop the kind of movement that we're all aspiring to. But I think the ecological factor is what gives it the tremendous urgency it has now, and that's why it's critical to emphasize that the socialism and ecology are integrally connected. I mean, in one sense, it's a redundancy because they belong together. They exist together in Marx, which is an important insight, I think, especially that's been very well expounded in the monthly review. But beyond that, the emphasis of sort of putting the eco prefix underscores that link, and may be helpful in gaining the attention of people who recognize this larger problem. So I think, so let me just say, by way of a practical conclusion, my books are there. They cost, with a discount, $15, and 1/3 of it will go to the Niebyl Proctor Library, for which I thank you very much for having me here. It's great, and I look forward to the discussion we can have now.
Okay, but before, thank you. Before we have that discussion, please reach in your wallets or purses and take out all your money, because we want you to give it to us. I think we're kind of like a model of the sort of institution you were talking about, prefiguring what we need to have to analyze what's going on in that society. And that's what we do here at the library and at the Institute. It may surprise you, but we get no funding from the corporate foundations, Soros or anybody else, and we would not accept it if they offered it, because we would prefer, we're a grassroots organization, and we would prefer to rely on you, the people that come here. And so we're actually in pretty good shape, the Institute is. The library is not, but we are linked to them. So please bear this in mind and give what you feel appropriate. The other thing I wanted to announce is,
Has to have it, James.
Please fill up this